Next, we're going to talk about some philosophic and theological issues as they develop in the world. The Arabic word aqidah means creed or a system of belief. In Islam, there were many theological concerns, as we saw in Christianity. In Christianity, we tracked the development of ideas about Trinity and about Christology. Trinity being their relationship between the three parts of the Trinity, Christology being the relationship between the various elements within the Son of God or within Jesus or within Christ. All these things mean the same thing, you might say, but they're different ways of referring to the mystery of how Jesus could be truly man and truly God, truly human and truly the Son of God. In Islam, there were issues with great theological concerns, and Quranic terms were often used to illustrate and to discuss these considerations. So, for example, Muslims debated the reality or the metaphoric means of the mizan. Was the balance that was referred to in scriptures, was it real or was it metaphoric? When God provides everybody with sustenance, is that sustenance real and limited by God, predetermined, or is it something that in fact people earn by their own efforts? There are many important creeds. Probably the most important one is Abu Hanifa's creed, the Fiqh Akbar. The link did not work earlier today. There is the creed of Tahawi, Hanafi, and the creed of Ibn Taymiyyah, a very lengthy discourse which is available on Islamic Web. The First Civil War happened in the end of the 650s into the 660s. Some people concluded that both parties, the party of Ali and the party of Muawiyah, the leader of the Umayyads, had leaders who were fallible, they were sinful, they were unfit, and they came to believe that these things were grave sins, kaba'ir in Arabic, and required grave consequences. Put very simply, the Kharijites came to believe that grave sinners could be executed or exiled. They could not be followed, and rather than following a caliph from the tribe of Muhammad, they would reject following that caliph if that caliph came from a line of people who did kaba'ir. The next group that I'm going to talk about very briefly is the Murji'ites. The term came from Surah 9. Others are deferred to God's commandment. And they said that we human beings, do not want to make judges about who is or who is not a Muslim. We're not going to claim that those who have kaba'ir, are grave sins, are not Muslims. And they probably arose in the aftermath of the Second Civil War, which came to end with the death of Imam Hussein in 680. Unlike the Shias, who rejected Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, as well as Ali, and the Sunnis, who generally accepted all four first caliphs as Rashidun, rightly guided, generally the Murji'ites accepted Abu Bakr and Umar, but they were kind of neutral in Uthman versus Ali. They distanced themselves from those who rejected them, but they also rejected some of the more radical Shiite views. The idea of leaving the decision to God became an official position, at least in some parts of it, of the Umayyad. Quoting from the Encyclopedia of Islam, 2nd edition, the identification of faith with true belief to the exclusion of acts became the essential trait of Irja, was clearly implied, though not central, in the earliest Murji'ite teaching. Faith to the exclusion of acts. One could become a Muslim by saying so. One was a Muslim, and one did not have to. The act which one did not trump the faith that one claimed to have had. One of the next theological viewpoints, theological discussions, was that of qadr versus jabr. The term qadr, which means power, was used by both sides of this issue. The free will position was somewhat anti-Umayyad, against the ruling powers. Jabr, the word means compulsion, came to be applied to the position that God has total power and initiative in all events. Qadr came to be applied to the position that human beings have free will and human beings freely choose what they want to do. This is an issue that faces many religions today. If God is all-powerful, how can there be evil? If we get to choose our own acts, how can God have power over them? If God knows what's going to happen and we, in fact, fulfill our roles in the history of the world as determined by God, how can God then punish us for doing bad things which God has decreed have to occur, because that's how history will transpire. The Abbasids, who ruled from 750, and after 850 they ruled but did not really. They reigned, but there were other people who exerted political power. During the first century of Abbasid rule, there was tremendous interest in philosophic ideas like the Qadr versus Jabr, like the ideas of the Mutazilites, like the ideas of the Murji'ites that we had. They built and promoted a house of wisdom. They had intellectual discussions. Caliphs are reported to have discussions which included Shias, non-Muslims, Christians, Jews, even polytheists in their courts. This was also a time in which the ancient Greek tradition was translated first to Syriac and then to Arabic, so that by the death of Ishaq ibn Hunayn in 911, most of the ancient Greek scientific and philosophic tradition, Aristotle, medical works, and so on, were available in Arabic. In some cases, the only reason that we today have the texts is because they disappeared in Greek in the Byzantine Empire, for example, and never made it to the Roman, to Latin. The only reason we have some of the texts is because they were preserved in Arabic and later translated from Arabic, and again through an intermediary language, Arabic into Hebrew, Hebrew into Latin. I refer very briefly to the Mutazilis. The original meaning of this term was a group which stood aloof from the earliest debates about the Shia, about the Kharijites, the Murji'ites, who should rule, who shouldn't rule, and the word Mutazil means to hold apart or to withdraw. And in that particular time, those were people who did not want to make any decisions whatsoever about who should rule and so on. The term came, however, to be associated with a set of theological ideas that we often, looking back historically from a Western vantage point, considered to be liberal and rational. They often were called the people of justice and unity because of some of their main positions. One of those was incorporeality, the reference to the hands and the eyes and the face of God did not mean that God actually had hands, eyes, face, etc. Another idea was God was incomparable. Nothing could compare with God. Another idea that they had was that the statement, God did this, or God is powerful, or God desires such and such a thing, doesn't mean that God has power or desire that can be debated in any way, shape, or form differently from the essence of God. If God is one, then God is totally one. What you can say is that if God wills such and such a thing, or if God is merciful, for example, God is not therefore comparable to people who are merciful, or God doesn't have an attribute of mercy which exists somehow or other separately from his essence. They developed an idea of negative attributes. God's essence is one, and when we say God is merciful, that means we deny an attribute of unmercifulness to God. Obviously, this is a rather abstruse philosophic term, but we have some of the same arguments in Western thought. The Mu'tazilis believed that the Quran was created in time. The Quran was not part of the essence of God. The Mu'tazilis believed that God always wills good for his creatures. One of the problems with the idea of divine justice was that God could only do what is just. And some people thought that Mu'tazilis limited God by the way they formulated this statement. Much as we saw in Christianity, where there were Eastern Orthodox who agreed with some of the basic ideas of the middle part of the Trinity being truly man and truly God, but disagreed with some of the formulations that resulted from that. Don't know that the enemies of the Mu'tazilis could be saying, well, God does evil all the time. But they had a problem with God's acts being necessity, because God could not do otherwise than his acts. That limitation of God was the problem. The Mu'tazilis also believed that reason could be used to define and determine what is good. One famous debate that the Mu'tazilis had is the story about three brothers, bad, a good one, and one who dies young. Is it fair to the one who dies young? One might say, well, if he had grown up, he would be bad, and therefore it was good that he died young. Another one say, well, if you all begin equal, he lacked the opportunity to prove himself. And Mu'tazilis would use the story of the three brothers to talk about divine justice and about another concept, the concept of the middling state between paradise and inferno, a kind of limbo where souls of the indeterminate souls would come to rest. Mu'tazili doctrine is often summarized as 5 points: justice, unity, the threat and promise, intermediate status, and commending the good and prohibiting the disapproved. Although point 5 is very often associated with the thought police, the religious police in many countries in the Islamic world today, it also was a very important part of the Mu'tazili doctrine. The Kalamists, the theological movements of Islam, gave rise to a response to Mu'tazilim associated with Al-Ash'ari, who died in 935. Al-Ash'ari and his followers generally taught predestination. The Quran was uncreated. God was omnipotent. There was a reality to divine attributes, although we do not know how. They also taught that human beings acquire their actions. The actions are created by God. God judges them and makes them, but by doing them, we acquire them and acquire praise and blame for them. I have listed on this slide a number of important philosophers. I suspect that the most important ones of them are the 12th century ones. Al-Ghazali died 1111, Ibn Tufayl, and Ibn Rushd, just 3 of them in general. Ibn Rushd of Averroes died 1198. Averroes is a strikingly rationalist philosopher, and the final chapter of his book about Al-Ghazali's thought, talking about the incoherence of the incoherence. Al-Ghazali's book was called The Incoherence of Philosophy. So his final chapter in The Incoherence of the Incoherence argues that religion in general, and Islam specifically, is true because it's the best way of ordering society. I always find this to be striking, because Averroes is not arguing that religion is true because it was revealed by God. It was true because it is the best way of ordering society. Scientific argument, you might say, for the truth of religion. In any case, after the 1200s, or after around the death of Ibn Rushd, there were very, very few classic rational philosophers in Islam who were not affected by the religiosity. So you'll find philosophers who write in a very religious way and reflect a kind of backlash to philosophy.